We are live, and I want to welcome everyone here with us tonight at Il Palmerino and in London. We're broadcasting from two places. I'm Linda Falcone with Advancing Women Artists and Il Palmerino, and I'm here with Claudia Tobin, author, scholar, art historian. Thank you so much, Claudia, for being with us tonight.
Oh, lovely to be here. Thank you.
Yes. I wanted to welcome guests. This is an event that's part of the Oltrarno Gaze calendar, and we have many partners involved, the Comune of Florence, the Municipality of Florence, and Feel Florence, and we have the patronage tonight of the British Institute of Florence, as well as the US Consulate in Florence. And so we're very happy to have people from all over the world, and I'm seeing people tuning in from our hometown here in Florence, but from other places. I see California, I see London, and yeah, people are starting to move in. I see Portland, Maine, etc. So just to introduce you for a moment, Claudia, you are, as I said before, an author, the author of Modernism and Still Life, Artists, Writers, and Dancers, and co-editor of Ways of Drawing, Artist Perspectives and Practice. And you have contributed to major exhibitions on Virginia Woolf at the National Portrait Gallery in London, that also traveled from Tate St. Ives to the Fitzwilliams Museum in Cambridge. And you recently completed a fellowship at the Center for Renaissance Studies at Villa Ittati, and have a very deep connection with Il Palmerino because of your studies on Vernon Lee. And I have the good fortune of being here at Palmerino. Behind me, you can see there's a little photograph of Vernon Lee. So you can see the tiny photograph. She's keeping us company. I'm trying to not to block it, but there we go. She's keeping us company tonight. So Claudia, why don't I go off screen and we'll get some slides up for you, and you can begin your traveling portraits discussion. And we're excited to be without our suitcases, but traveling virtually to another century.
Thank you, Linda. Well, thank you so much to Linda and to Advancing Women Artists and Federica at Il Palmerino Cultural Association for the invitation to speak this evening. When Federica and Linda first invited me to speak as part of the series, I was actually at Il Palmerino, the former home of the writer Vernon Lee. And I was happily immersed in a project on Lee and the Italian Renaissance as part of the fellowship, as Linda mentioned, at Ittati in Florence. And I was exploring Vernon Lee's aesthetics, her connections to artists in Florence, and her writings on the Italian Renaissance. But alongside this, I kept being drawn back to her relationship to a slightly younger generation of artists and writers who she engaged with and who in many ways she influenced, including Ottoline Morrell, Virginia Woolf, and Vanessa Bell. So since this talk is part of a larger program exploring the gaze and portraiture, and since I'm now sadly far from Florence, back in the UK due to this ongoing pandemic and lockdown, it's lovely to have this opportunity to travel a little with you and with these four women. Some of them will be better known to you than others, perhaps. So we have the writer Virginia Woolf, her sister, the painter Vanessa Bell, the arts patron and photographer Ottoline Morrell, and the writer Vernon Lee, who, as you know, lived in Florence for most of her life. So tonight we'll trace a few of their artistic journeys, taking in portraits of people and places that they created, which might open up points of connection between the artistic communities of Florence and London. Each of the women we'll be exploring was, in their own way, a radical thinker and experimenter, across different media and living through a period of great social and political change and upheaval. They were all connected to the Bloomsbury group of intellectuals and artists who gathered in London, in the quarter known as Bloomsbury, in the early 20th century. But journeys to Italy or meetings there were to shape their lives to a lesser or greater extent. So this will be a short excursion through some words and images which offer up particular snapshots or moments in their lives, asking what it means to make verbal or visual portraits of people and places. As Virginia Woolf wrote of the task of the biographer, we can only hope to, and as she put it, hang up looking glasses at odd angles in the attempt to catch a fleeting glimpse of our subjects and perhaps sometimes an insight into their inner lives. So I wanted to start this exploration of 4 women artists with this image that you see in front of you. Hopefully you can all see this, that Linda's helpfully sharing for me. This image by Vanessa Bell, titled A Conversation and painted between 1913 and 16. The painting now hangs in the Courtauld Gallery in London. So like many of the painters in her circle, Bell was inspired by modern French painting, and she became an innovator in colour and form, pushing abstraction to its limits long before many of her contemporaries. And she was also co-founder of an interior design company and artists cooperative called the Omega Workshops, which worked across, so she was really experimenting across the fine and decorative arts. But in this painting, Bell creates a chromatic relationship between the conversing women and the flowers or the flower bed outside the window, which we see as rendered as flat blobs of colour, almost, I think, like speech bubbles sort of rising up between the women. There's a compelling intimacy to these 3 women, huddled and intent. It's partly conspiratorial, I think, as an image, and I think it says a lot about female conversation, friendship, and intimacy. Though their backs are turned, I see that there's a kind of invitation for us to join or imagine we're joining this conversation for a little while, particularly as one of the women, woman in profile, is sort of proffering her hand, this gesture of, there's a kind of emphatic gesture there that I think we can also read as an invitation on this occasion. And so for the next little while, we'll imagine the 3 women as Vernon Lee, Virginia Woolf, and Ottoline Morrell, with Bell as the painter. So for Virginia Woolf, this painting suggested Bell's ability as a short story writer. Originally, the painting was titled 3 Women, and Woolf wrote to her sister, "I think you're a most remarkable painter, but I maintain you are, into the bargain, a satirist, a conveyor of impressions about human life, a short story writer of great wit, and able to bring off a situation in a way that rouses my envy." She concluded wondering whether she herself could write 3 Women, the earlier title of the painting, in prose. Bell and Woolf often challenged each other on their respective arts, and I think this gives us a sense of the mutual inspiration that the sisters, in their different art forms, offered each other. Woolf and Bell's commitment to their respective art forms began early. And I think this is exemplified in the next slide, this photograph here of the family, the young Stephen sisters with their brothers. So here we see Vanessa Bell, or Vanessa Stephen, as she was then known before her marriage, at her easel with a paintbrush in hand, and she's looking out at the viewer with a determined gaze. And at her side, we see Virginia, an open book on her lap. But we might notice, looking at this photograph, that her gaze is in fact directed at Vanessa's canvas, not at the book, and we might even detect a slight sense of consternation in her eyes. The phrase "the sister arts" comes to mind as appropriate here, not only given the familial ties between the sisters, but because it suggests something of the relationship of rivalry as well as mutual inspiration. which can, of course, characterize the relationship between sisters, but also has a long tradition in the history of relations between the literary and the visual arts. Now, the Bloomsbury group formed at 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury, where Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf, or as they were then known, Vanessa and Virginia Stephen, moved to with their siblings in 1904 after the death of their parents. And moving to this area of London was really a symbol of change, of a new beginning. As Woolf put it, here everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial. And this group of friends and family made original contributions to painting, literature, and economics, as well as experimenting in alternative ways of living and unconventional domestic arrangements. And although Vanessa and Virginia were, of course, at the heart of this group and lived in Bloomsbury for much of their lives, Ottoline Morrell was closely connected to the group as a patron and living nearby for much of her life, and Vernon Lee visited and lived in the area for short periods. All of these women were engaged in different ways in the project of describing the human being in all its complexity and mutability across visual and verbal forms, in ways that sought not only or not necessarily to achieve a likeness of appearance, but to capture something of the fleeting, the evanescent inner life of an individual and the instability of the modern persona. So let's just move on to the next image, please. So here we see Vanessa Bell with paintbrush in hand. She made a series of portraits of women sitters, including of her sister, in an increasingly abstract phase from around 1910 to 14. Just waiting there for, I think you just need to, yeah, that's perfect, thank you. So she made this series of portraits of women sitters, which became increasingly, this was during a period of increasing abstraction from around 1910 to 14. And the role of abstract colour shapes in expressing mute yet emotionally powerful subjects is important in these portraits, which reveal her practice of blanking out the faces of her subjects. And we see an example of this in the next image, of her painting of Virginia Woolf, painted in 1912. Yes, that's the one. And this is now in the collection at the National Portrait Gallery in London. So Woolf, we see Woolf depicted here in a relaxed attitude. She's cradled by the arms of this bright orange chair, and she seems to be knitting or sewing. And Bell's use of bold black outlining here recalls the work of the post-impressionist painter, the French painter Paul Cézanne, who was a major influence on Bloomsbury and on Bell. But she's not using this technique to describe Woolf's facial features, and this is compelling as it draws the eye to her face, to these blurred features, and at the same time there's a sort of denial of access. We can't read her face. And this is taken even further in the following portrait, in the next image, of Woolf again. She seems almost a completely oblivious, unconcerned sitter or subject. She's perhaps snoozing in the garden, perhaps, and her face is completely unreadable, featureless. In these works, Bell seems to capture her sister in intimate, off-guard moments. They're portraits of private moments, a far cry from the tradition of stiffly posed Victorian portraits of their childhood, and yet they allow the subject to remain mysterious and elusive. Bell's work was not overtly subversive, but these identity-blurring elliptical treatment, this elliptical treatment of the portrait and her use of bold, non-naturalistic colour and abstract design during the pre-war and interwar years implicitly reassessed gender and artistic boundaries. And you might notice, looking at these portraits, that the elimination of facial features invites us as the viewer to fill in the gaps, as it were. And this is something that Bell's biographer, Frances Spalding, has observed. She describes the way, or she points out that we're given a blank oval, an empty space through which can flow thought, feeling, imagination. And she describes this as a radical solution to portraiture that suggests new ways of thinking about identity. So Bell's approach can be compared to Woolf's own experiment with the use of silence and ellipses in the attempt to evoke the inner life of her characters in her novels. And you might think particularly of To the Lighthouse in her depiction of Lily Briscoe, the painter, or Mrs. Ramsay. So let's just move on to this final sort of set of portraits by Bell, and I wanted to show you these portraits on ceramic dinner plates, which Bell made in collaboration with her friend and partner, the artist Duncan Grant. So together, she and Grant worked on multiple interior decoration collaborations and commissions, including the famous women dinner service, which they made in the early 1930s. And you see here their collaborative designs for the set of portraits on dinner plates, which were commissioned by the influential museum director and art historian Kenneth Clark. The complete set of 50 plates feature portraits of famous women throughout history, and they also include portraits of Bell and Woolf. And they really represent or testify to Bell and Grant's enduring interest in portraiture and in a sense, in painting women's achievements back into history, if you like. And indeed, Kenneth Clark recorded when he received the plates that here was Bloomsbury asserting its status as a matriarchy. Indeed, when the plates are viewed as a complete set, we're sort of invited to imagine a supper party, I think, of brilliant and powerful women gathered together. They construct a new canon of women who excelled as actresses, queens, beauties, and writers, in which Bell and Woolf take their place. The sisters, so Bell and Woolf's correspondence, often centered on their practice and how their different art forms might relate to each other or be different. And to explore this a little further, I want us to travel now to Italy, to an earlier moment in which Virginia and Vanessa were still at an early stage in their artistic careers, reflecting on their practice as they responded to the landscape and artworks they encountered in Italy while traveling there in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1909, Vanessa Bell reported to her sister from Italy in early springtime. Today it was all grey, with only one brilliant streak of light in the distance. I kept thinking of how various painters would have treated it, and I flattered myself that I saw how it ought to be treated, but I could not do it. A melancholy watercolour of a sunset is my only achievement. With a touch of rivalry, she goes on to demonstrate the force of painting and possibility of her own medium. She observes to Woolf, her sister, "You writers, however, do not know the joy of experimenting in a new medium, especially in one of which one is quite ignorant. One seems to come upon so many unexpected capacities in oneself." Later that spring, when she'd reached Florence, Vanessa was summoning her sister's spirit. She wrote to her, "Last night, as we sat on our veranda, we saw a firefly. Wasn't it romantic? It looked very ghostly, a tiny white point of flame floating about in the garden. I thought at first it must be your disembodied spirit come to visit me." So there's this sense in which the sisters haunted each other's art and ideas, even or especially when one of them was absent. The previous year, when Virginia was aged 26, she had travelled with her sister and brother-in-law Clive Bell through Italy. And although in some ways she'd been less enraptured by the art and architecture than her companions, she was particularly struck by a fresco by Perugino in Perugia. And we see this here. I think possibly the fresco that Woolf records. And she notes in her journal, in her travel journal, that each part has a dependence on the others. They compose one idea in his mind. that idea has nothing to do with anything that can be put into words. And she goes on to note that his figures, Perugino's figures, seem sealed and infinitely silent, as though beauty had swum up to the top and stayed there. And yet these frescoes also prompted her to reflect on her own vision of beauty, as expressed in her own medium of words. And in her journal, and you see a page of this in the next image. So you see here just a page from her travel journal. She writes, "As for writing, I want to express beauty too. I attain a different kind of beauty, achieve a symmetry by means of infinite discords, showing all the traces of the mind's passage through the world, and achieve in the end some kind of whole made of shivering fragments. To me, this seems the natural process, the flight of the mind." So in a sense here, we sort of witness her sketching out what would become anyway, her stream of consciousness technique, which was to be so central to her own experiments in fiction and life writing. And we see from her journal entry that she was seeking out a path for her writing, which would take in or respond to and increasingly relate to the ways in which modern painting also involved the deconstruction of objects or the representation of a person from multiple perspectives and unfamiliar angles. That attempt to unify fleeting impressions or fragments into a coherent whole, which would become really central to the painters in her circle. So let's just move on to the following image. And this painting is Bell's portrait of the Duomo at Pisa, made in 1912. And it became part of Virginia's and her husband Leonard's collection at their home at Monk's House in Sussex, in the Sussex countryside. And it would have, I think, summoned the colour of Italy onto their walls and the architecture of the towns that they'd visited. And in the following image, we see another view of an Italian town. This time it's unspecified, but painted the same year. And this also became part of Woolf's collection, or it has subsequently at Monk's house. So on Woolf's second trip to Italy, she had resolved to, as she described it, to write not only with the eye, but with the mind, and discover real things beneath the show. But this proved challenging for the passing traveller. And decades later, in the 30s, she created her own transitory portraits of Pisa and Siena, recording her visits in her diaries. In Pisa, in spring, she records watching the Arno swimming past with the usual coffee-coloured foam. She walks in the cloisters and she observes, "This is true Italy with the old dusty smell, people swarming in the streets." And then on another occasion, she records how all the colours are white bluish marble against a very light saturated sky. On another occasion, she describes Siena and its most beautiful of views, which she expresses as being like a line of poetry that makes itself, the shaped hill, all flushed, red and greens, the elongated lines, cultivated every inch, old, wild, perfectly said once and for all. And finally, we get a passing, but I think vivid image of Florence on a slightly later visit. She notes, "I came through Florence today, saw the green and white cathedral and the yellow Arno dribbling into shallows. A thunderstorm. Irises purple against the clouds." So in a sense, she seems to be painting her impressions in words as she travels, responding to the colour, light and form of these landscapes, as her sister had evoked them in her paintings. And yet, as she had written to her friend Ethel Smythe, it was almost impossible to evoke the landscape, the Italian landscape, and not simply through impressions which reflected one's own mind, but with something deeper and closer to its essence. And so she concluded, "Italy beats me." When Vanessa and Virginia travelled to Italy in 1908, they met Vernon Lee in Florence. And this portrait by Lee's friend Sargent, John Singer Sargent, was painted a couple of decades prior to their meeting. But it gives you a sense, I think, of Lee's appearance, that alert gaze that was so definitive. And for Vanessa and Virginia, Lee would have presented or represented the old guard, the spirit of their parents' generation, when they were in fact trying to break away and experiment with new ideas. And part of their move to Bloomsbury was motivated by this impulse. So they didn't, I think, at this point at least, recognize how radical Lee was. There are a few journal entries and descriptions of this meeting in Florence. So it's rather tantalizing to try and work out the sort of details of their meeting and their response to Lee. But of course, journeys through and to Italy can also take place in the mind and in the memory. And in the 20s, Woolf revisited Italy in her diaries and letters. And she remembered train travels across the country and the meeting with Vernon Lee. And she recalled this meeting as the occasion when Lee fell in love with Vanessa, as she put it. But she also remembered much earlier occasions, recalling Lee's visits to her family home during their childhood. And she conjures an image of her at the end of the 19th century in the dining room at her childhood home at what was called Talland House in Cornwall, where the Stephen family spent their summer holidays. And Woolf remembered her in a coat and skirt, much as she is now. But that was 30 years ago. She was a dashing authoress. She gave my father her books, which were in the dining room too. So Lee had made her entrance into their childhood and was therefore associated with their parents' generation. But she was still a dashing authoress. Woolf had mixed feelings about Lee's writing, but she read and reviewed her books, and they remained a point of comparison and a model for what writing should or should not be. On one occasion, she complained that Lee really turns all good writing to vapor. And on a later occasion, she reminded herself that one cannot let the pen write without guidance, for fear of becoming slack and untidy like Vernon Lee. However, later Woolf did come to recognize Lee as a guiding light for women writers by her polemical feminist essay, A Room of One's Own, which we can see in the cover of in the next image, this cover designed by Vanessa Bell. And so this essay was published in 1929, but it was written as a lecture for girls at the female colleges at Cambridge University. And in her essay, Woolf singles out Vernon Lee's books on aesthetics, alongside the contributions of other modern women such as Gertrude Bell on Persia and Jane Harrison on Greek archaeology. So this was a clear sense of the significance this gives us a clear sense of the significance with which she regarded Lee's contribution. And she went on to publish Lee with her own publishing house, the Hogarth Press, and even wrote Lee into a short story in which one of the characters identifies her own love of beauty with that of Vernon Lee. So just to quote from that character, we read, "I never spoke to her, but in a sense, the true sense, I who love beauty always feel I knew Vernon Lee." So in Woolf's story, this love of beauty is closely associated with Vernon Lee. So we move now on to meet Ottoline Morrell, who we see here dancing on the steps of her home. A few years before Vanessa and Virginia had appeared on Vernon Lee's doorstep, another young woman from Bloomsbury had arrived. And this was Ottoline Cavendish Bentinck, as she was known before her marriage to Philip Morrell, and before she'd become involved in supporting artists and those involved in the Bloomsbury group. She was traveling through Italy and she met with Vernon Lee, and Lee seems to have taken Ottoline under her wing, as Ottoline later recorded with pleasure the visits they had made together to Florentine villas and around the city in around 1898 to 1899. Ottoline recorded, "I enjoyed these drives immensely, for she was extremely active in mind and imparted her intellect and knowledge very well." So Lee would have communicated to Ottoline her love for and knowledge of Italian art and culture, taking her to the museums and galleries, and one imagines introducing her to the Tuscan landscape and, of course, to the gardens. Lee believed that perhaps the best place to get to know a school of painting was through the local landscape. And in her Tuscan notes, she writes that it is in the fields with their qualities of air, of light, and their whole train of sensations and moods that the special artistic temperament of a local school can very probably be traced. Lee had also felt drawn to Ottoline's receptivity to her ideas, and it was characteristic of her to draw female companions into an intense kind of mentorship. And she evidently had a similar idea for Ottoline and wrote to her after her departure. She wrote, "I have often had a little passing dream of trying to give you the benefit of my additional 20 years of reading, thinking, and in practical life." She goes on to say, "I can teach you infinitely less than any person at Oxford, but I think we might think things out together, which is sometimes quite fruitful." Ottoline declined the offer, but they remained in touch. And Ottoline remained under the spell of Italy, returning there for her honeymoon. And we just see in the following couple of images, Ottoline at St. Mark's in Venice, and another, I think, of Ottoline in Venice there, quite an atmospheric photograph. But I think Vernon Lee's idea of thinking out things together is an important one, and particularly important to the idea of a female network of artists, a network of support and inspiration. And Lee had created a literary salon at her villa at Il Palmerino, this 15th century villa which emerges from the shade of umbrella pines and plane trees on the road between Florence and Fiesole, where she had moved in 1889. And that's, I think we've got an image of that next, of Palmerino. So over the years, Lee hosted a cosmopolitan array of artists, writers, and thinkers who were attracted to her conversation and her expertise on aesthetics and Italian art, and indeed to the theatrical and musical events she put on at the villa. Visitors included Oscar Wilde, Edith Wharton, the painter John Singer Sargent, and of course many Italian writers and intellectuals such as Carlo Placci and the painter Telemaco Signorini, along with her neighbours Mary and Bernard Berenson, and many others. I think that this idea of a place that could gather together different minds from different parts of Europe to think together really appealed to Ottoline, and I suggest anyway that it lies partly behind her idea for her own salon, which she created at her home in Bedford Square in London, just behind the British Museum, and also at her Oxfordshire house, Garsington. And both of these spaces became places in which vibrant, creative, and social life could flourish. So Ottoline Morrell became a patron of Bloomsbury artists. But as you see from these photographs taken by the celebrated photographer Cecil Beaton in the late 20s, she was also a striking figure and experimenter in dress, sometimes dressing in clothes inspired by the portraits that she saw in museums and galleries. And she recorded that, "When I see old Italian or Flemish pictures or modern French or English ones, I know that what they express to me is some individual vision of the world." And her own individual vision and appearance was part of what attracted artists to paint her. She became a model for many of her artist friends and contemporaries, including Duncan Grant, Henry Lamb, Simon Bussey, Charles Conder, Augustus John, and Dorothy Brett. And this next image that we see is by Dorothy Brett, titled Umbrellas. And I think it gives us a sense of Ottoline's sort of creative spirit at the center of her circle of friends, all gathered around her, depicted here in a pink dress on the lawn at her home in Garsington. So Ottoline and her husband Philip had bought the rather run-down manor house, Garsington, in Oxfordshire, which included 200 acres of garden and farmland, and had views over the Berkshire Downs. And we see an image of the house in the next image. And even on her first visit to Garsington, there was something about its hilltop position looking out onto the blue hillside that reminded Ottoline of Italy. And her vision for the garden took inspiration from formal Italian gardens, which had made a profound impression on her when she visited as a younger woman, and experienced the clear geometry of the gardens that Lee had shown her around Florence and those that belonged to her aunt at Villa Capponi. And her delight in these gardens led her to embark on an ambitious restoration and planting scheme at Garsington. And you see in this photograph Garsington with its Italianate loggia, its cypress avenues in the style of a Renaissance garden, and its statues, and you might not quite see them in this image, but they had brought back statues from Italy and spent large sums on them in the hope of, as they described, making Garsington more Italian. So Garsington was one of the places where the four women we're exploring this evening would have crossed paths. During the war years and through the 20s, Garsington became a gathering place for artists, writers, and intellectuals who benefited from Ottoline's support and hospitality. And she described how sometimes she felt that Garsington was a theatre, and that week after week a travelling company would arrive and play their parts. And this travelling company included writers such as Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, D.H. Lawrence, and Aldous Huxley, poets such as Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, and painters such as Duncan Grant and, as we've seen, Dorothy Brett. And Ottoline herself was at the heart of this theatre, if you like, playing her part with often very elaborate costumes and dresses. But she also had a strong interest in photography. And Ottoline captured her guests at moments of relaxation and conversation. And some of the most striking of these photographs are her images of Virginia Woolf that you see next, taken in the 20s. So these photographs evoke, I think, something of the defiant and sometimes decadent spirit of the 20s. And we see Woolf, in conversation with friends and smoking there in her beautiful hat. And but they belie the fact that the decade prior to this had, of course, been some of them had seen some of the most turbulent and painful years, the years of the First World War. One of the most significant roles that Garsington played was as a refuge to the many pacifists and conscientious objectors in the Morrell circle, some of them well known, such as Bertrand Russell. And Ottoline and Philip were themselves openly opposed to the war. Ottoline described their shared aim to make a centre at Garsington for those who saw the war as it really was, not through false emotional madness and the intoxication of war fever. So this brings us back to Vernon Lee, as Lee was a strident pacifist herself, publishing a pacifist satire during the war, The Ballet of the Nations. And as we see in the next image, her peace with honour. During the war, she was forced to leave Palmerino and go back to England, and she stayed for a time near Ottoline's home in London and would often visit her at Bedford Square, where many other prominent pacifists would also meet. Lee gives us, in the middle of the war, a portrait of the spaces she was inhabiting and the kind of mood from 1915. She writes that she is living in a very quiet, old-fashioned square close behind the museum. That's the British Museum, which, together with Ottoline, is my great attraction to this old-fashioned part of the world. She goes on to say that her friends have sent flowers and watercolours of Italian vistas for when she feels homesick. But something about Bloomsbury made her feel at home, and she wrote that there is something adventurous about it, vaguely continental in this part of town. She also records the presence of Belgian refugees, writing to her friend that you have no conception what it means to have half the fugitive population of Belgium quartered in every town, every village, every house, including Ottoline's. After the war, Vernon Lee was relieved to return home to her villa and garden at Il Palmerino. When she'd first moved there, she was on the verge of collapse, and her brother Eugene's health was deteriorating. And from her letters of the period, it's clear that the house and the garden in particular played an important role in rejuvenating her health, physical and mental, and that of her brothers. Over the years, she had spent time in London and travelling through Europe, but she was always happy to return to the landscape she knew so well, beguiled by that sense of the spirit of place, or genus loci, as she described it, and which she recognised in this part of Tuscany. In her essay, Beauty and Sanity, she begins with an exclamation of relief at having escaped the city. She writes, "Out of London at last, though after only 2 months. And although this time she is not within a walk of my clump of bay trees on the Fiesole hill, the countryside reminds her of the Tuscan grace and serene austerity that she so admired." In her lyrical essay on the genus loci, published in 1899, Lee sees a possibility for a sense of profound connection to certain places, a kind of friendship, as she expresses it. To certain among us, undeniably, places, localities, become objects of intense and most intimate feeling, quite irrespective of their inhabitants and virtually of their written history. They can touch us like living creatures, and one can have with them friendship of the deepest and most satisfying sort. So I just wanted to end this journey tracing the travelling portraits of Virginia Woolf, Vanessa Bell, Ottoline Morrell, and Vernon Lee, with Lee herself back at her home at Il Palmerino, where she lived until her death in 1935. And since I'm longing to return there myself, I thought I'd end with a phrase from Lee's contribution to a book titled "In Praise of Gardens Old and New," where she writes about old Italian gardens. And in our own time of restricted travel, when we're all far from friends and from the creative minds that nourish us, I think Lee's words might strike a chord as she writes, "In the garden, every portent points to hopeful travel." Thank you.
Here we are. Thank you so much, Claudia. It's been a pleasure to be with you tonight and with these ladies, with these dashing women of another time, but also that inspire our time as well. And actually, we have a couple of questions, but before I ask you those questions from our public, I wanted to give them an invitation, because I was very much struck by the phrase, I who have loved beauty felt I have known Vernon Lee. And we have about 150 people watching today, and I wanted to launch that question, right? If they can think of women artists or women writers through the various mediums, as you discuss, that make them feel in some way, I have known beauty, or I feel I have known this artist, writer, etc.
Lovely idea.
So if those watching want to answer that question, I who have loved beauty felt I have known blank.
Lovely.
And if you want to answer that question, I'll put you on the spot right away. Who would you choose?
Well, I think at least a few of those we've sort of discussed and travelled with this evening. But I love that idea because it goes back to, I think, what I was trying to evoke, this sense of conversation. By beginning with that painting by Bell, which really captures that sense of the intensity and the intimacy of female conversation. But that we could also, that we can also think about a conversation through generations, and that's playing out in the relationship between, I think, Woolf and Lee, sometimes an uneasy relationship between those generations. But nonetheless, that we can gain inspiration and ideas, whether we're reading the works of the past or whether we're directly in conversation with other artists who are our own contemporaries.
Yeah, I was, as you were speaking, I was realizing how much I've missed words. Because oftentimes with early women artists, you lack the words, their words. And so it's really fascinating to see this bridge between painting, for example, and literature, particularly with Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell, and their conversations and their different ideas as to what makes the better message, almost what makes the clearer message.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I've it's, as everyone has, it's one of the frustrations of lockdown has been, at least where I am now in the UK, is that you can't get into the libraries and you can't get into the museums, so you can't have those. You can only, well, in part, have those conversations, and I've really missed, having access to Lee's work and Woolf's diaries, and only the things that I can gather from my sort of traveling library here. So it's sort of all intensified that longing for words and images in lockdown, I think.
Well, I will say, I mean, I hope that we bring you a piece of Palmerino tonight, and you certainly have brought us a piece of Palmerino as well, from afar.
Lovely to see the bookshelf behind you.
Yeah, I can't. Let's see. How does it? Where does it? That way.
With all those positions of Vernon Lee behind you.
Yes. So there was a question about the plates and the canon of women from different walks of knowledge. So where can we find those?
Well, that's a good question, because there's a wonderful gallery called Piano Nobile in London, and they handled I think what happened was the plates that were, part of this commission, Kenneth Clark's commission, I think they sort of sat in a box somewhere for many, many years, undiscovered, but I think, known about, but not discovered until very recently. I think it was about 3 years ago now that they came upon them. And Piano Nobile did this beautiful exhibition. They're based in London. They did this beautiful exhibition of the work, and then they were managing the sale of the work. And I know there was some talk of it going to Charleston, which was the kind of Bloomsbury's farmhouse in Sussex, and it's now a museum. You can go and visit it, but I don't know if that went through. I'm not quite sure. I hope it has. But one way that you can find out more about it is they did a really beautiful catalogue, and and there's a on the British Art Studies website, which is part of the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art. There's a sort of online exhibition in one of their issues, which I did a little bit of work on, and there's some really beautiful images of the plates, and they give you a lot more kind of context on them. But I think that the aim was that they would be bought by a museum or somewhere that the public could view them. But I'll have to follow up on that one and see where they've ended up, because it was so fantastic seeing them. It was very interesting seeing them anyway displayed on the wall, because of course usually we see dining plates, and they were used as dining plates on a table, and so it's a very different perspective to play with the idea of portraiture, seeing something on the wall rather than or as it should be perhaps on the wall rather than flat on the table. So it was really interesting to see those, and see the sort of gathering of these different women in their sort of vision of for the famous women dinner set. So yes, the British Art Studies website is one way to find out more.
I'm spying over here in the corner, looking at some of the names that people have mentioned in terms of the women that have inspired them. I have known beauty because I who have loved beauty have known Phoebe Turquire. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. The expressive works of Sophonis Banguisola, Rachel Rouge, Anna Akhmatova.
Yeah, with you on that one.
Let's see.
Wonderful poet.
Yeah, lovely. Lynette Yadom Boake. These are all women I need to look up. The portraits of Lynette Yadom Boake. Yeah. Let's see. We have a question from Ursula Fanning in Ireland. She says, great, really informative lecture. I'm fascinated by the intergenerational tension between Woolf and Lee, perhaps inevitable as Woolf sought to carve out her own path, ?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I touched on it, but that sense of, particularly probably at the time that they met first, that there was this sense of leaving behind their sort of Victorian childhood. They'd lost both their parents, and they had moved into this new space, this new part of London, and it was a sort of real break with the past, even in terms of their sort of interior decoration. They, Woolf remembered it as being full of light, and they experimented with interior decoration, and they brought color and light and experimented with interior decoration design, or at least Vanessa Bell did. So I think part of it is this sense of a sort of conscious decision to forge out a path that was different from that of the 19th century writer, and at that stage perhaps not quite recognizing what Vernon Lee could offer. But I think the fact that she's inscribed into a room of one's own is really significant, and she's sort of placed on the metaphorical bookshelf by Woolf there. So she's enshrined in any woman's room of one's own in that sense.
Gosh, we have a question, another one from Margie McKinnon. She's, hello, Claudia, Linda, and Federica. Hello, Margie. I was wondering if Virginia Woolf ever wrote a story inspired by Vanessa Bell's Three Women. Could you tell us?
Yeah, that's good question. I don't think she ever wrote. No, she didn't, as far as I know, write directly responding to that painting. But of course, there's, we might think of To the Lighthouse with that central figure of the artist, of the woman artist, Lily Briscoe, and that's one place we could go to think about how Woolf might have used Bell as a model in her writing. And we follow in that novel the struggle of the woman artist to attain her creative vision. And she hears these sort of echoing voices of Charles Tansley and Mr. Ramsay. This idea that women can't paint, women can't write, and that sort of echoes through the novel. So she's sort of writing against that in a sense. But they collaborated also closely on the cover designs for Woolf's novels. So Bell designed many of the book covers for her novels, and her story actually makes me think of her short story Kew Gardens, Woolf's story Kew Gardens, was published with images, woodcuts by Vanessa Bell, and there in that story you get these sort of snippets, these overheard fragments of conversation, not just between women, but you get that sort of sense of overheard conversation. So there's a sense there, perhaps, that Woolf's playing with some of the ideas that Bell is also intrigued by in painting her women.
The overheard conversations, right? Which is in a way what we're doing tonight, no?
Yes, exactly.
We have a couple more women, Maria Grazia Chiuri, Patti Smith, Toni Morrison, Ella Fitzgerald. Yes, definitely.
We need another sort of famous women dinner set, I think, to capture.
Yeah, I think we need to create. Everyone needs to create who they would put in their China set. And also, I think it would be a great assignment to write, a short story or some sort of couple of sentences entitled Three Women, and see what we could all come up with.
Yeah,
three women we want to talk about in our lives. So Martha Ladley, Martha, hello. The Girl with a Leica by Helen, very difficult names to pronounce tonight. Helen Janiceka, a biographical novel of the life of a photographer, Gadrataro. Oh, I lost it. The first woman photographer and reporter to die in action during the Spanish Civil War. So we have a lot of homework.
Yes, absolutely.
Your lecture inspired new thoughts and new avenues, definitely, to discover in our own traveling portraits. And I mean, I think that this dialogue that you've been talking about tonight is certainly a dialogue that we have to continue, as we look to these artists. And I know a lot of artists are actually watching tonight, and to invite them towards documentation, documentation of their paintings, documentation of their writing, perhaps putting their writing into the visual arts, through a collaborative, etc. So I just think it's, as you were saying, it's so important in times like these to start forging these relationships, because in 100 years' time, the question will be, what were people thinking?
Yes,
in 2021. So,
and I think since I'm in the UK, I mean, that spirit of kind of cosmopolitanism and those salons that these women created, particularly thinking of Vernon Lee, where people came from different parts of Europe and gathered there, and she hosted so many interesting writers, artists, intellectuals, thinkers. That all feels even more poignant in our sort of post-Brexit era, and I think those cultural links and bridges that we can make between London and Florence and the world more broadly are just so essential going forward, and artists and writers are at the forefront of that, I think.
Yes.
We imagine our futures post-pandemic. So
thank you so much, Claudia. I just want to end one of the most interesting things. Well, I'm going to take home the quote, "Italy beats me."
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm done for the day with that quote.
She sums it up.
She sums it up. She says it all.
I know. If Virginia Woolf can say that, then where can we go?
Yes, exactly. And many saluti from Federica Paretti here at Palmerino, and from all of us, all of those involved in the Oltrarno Gaze project. And Claudia, thank you so much. And thank you to our guests for joining us tonight for this fascinating conversation of traveling portraits.
Oh, it's so lovely to join you.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao.
Ciao.